We cruised the area for several days without hearing a sound or spotting a ship. Obviously, the British had redirected their convoy traffic. The fruitless search began to affect the disposition of the crew. Paulson, frustrated, contacted Admiral U-boats asking to be relocated into better hunting grounds. The answer suggested that headquarters was receiving excellent intelligence from Nova Scotia. Proceed into AL 69, Halifax convoy. Expected general course east-northeast 11 knots. Light defence, good hunting. We raced westward at high speed for 3 days. When we arrived at our designated position, it was night and the Black Sea breathed gently. U-557 stopped her engines and the sound operator began his watch. However, we spent the night without spotting the enemy. With the first morning rays, we resumed our chase and crossed the square in irregular patterns. At 15:10 the same afternoon, as I was plotting course at the small table in the control room, a man on the bridge shouted, "Smoke cloud, bearing 300. The captain dashed past me and leaped to the top. I heard him hollering at the man in unmistakable anger. "You call that a smoke cloud? It's a forest fire. Crew on battle stations." When I reached my place on the bridge, U-557 had turned toward the black smudge. As we approached, the cloud expanded into a broad black curtain of dense smoke and fumes. Then we spotted the mastheads and stacks of the zigzagging destroyers preceding the armada. 5 minutes later, a forest of masts crept over the sharp edge of the horizon. We were on collision course with a huge convoy. 35. Alarm! 15:45. The parade of ships had not yet appeared in the eye of the scope. Paulson relied solely upon the report from the sound room. The crew moved quietly on action stations. The torpedo gang flooded the tubes. The second mate adjusted his computer. I took the helm. 6:10. 2 sweepers came into view, sailing in erratic patterns. 16:25. The sound gear picked up 2 destroyers, propellers whirring at high revolutions. Both hunters made their moves as if not quite sure in which direction to search for the silent enemy. Azdic impulses began to bounce against our hull. 16:35. The sound mounted in volume and density. The hammering of piston engines, the thrashing of propellers, and the knocking and rumbling of many approaching vessels reached a fierce crescendo. 16:45. Weissner had calculated the convoy's speed and course. The rest was up to Paulson, and he swung his boat into attack position. His hands were busy adjusting the scope to the ups and downs of the sea, training the crosshair on the fattest targets. Suddenly he shouted the decisive order, "Tubes 1 to 5 ready." "Tubes 1 to 5 are ready," assured Kern. Paulson released 5 shots within 25 seconds. We in the conning tower counted the seconds until the torpedoes hit. Meanwhile, the captain kept turning, extending and retracting the scope, watching the cargo ships approach in orderly fashion. There they swayed in a sluggish sea, innocently carried away to their destruction. Within a minute, this respectable parade of 45 rocking giants would be disrupted by fiery breaking ships. The rest of the vessels would spurt away, their crews terrified by the horror of devastation. Then came 1, 2, 3 hard explosions. The captain, all smiles, shouted, "Exec, write down, hit on freighter, 5,000 tons. Hit on second vessel, also 5,000 tons. Hit on 4,000-ton freighter astern, 2 misses. What's the matter with those damn torpedoes?" 17:05. We in the tower were given a chance to view the Holocaust. 3 vessels lay heavily listing, shooting smoke and fire columns into the air. White lifeboats hung head down in their davits. 2 destroyers raced toward the dying ships. It was a painting of rare and vivid colours. 17:10. Depth charges detonated close by. Paulson jokingly insisted that they were at least 1,000 metres away. 7:20. Escorts disappeared. Sound contact with convoy was considerably reduced. 1800. Cook distributed coffee and battle sandwiches. Too much salami. The sweating torpedo gang hoisted up 5 steel fish and reloaded the tubes. The chief balanced the boat like a juggler. The captain sat at the scope watching the convoy flee toward the southern tip of Ireland. 20-225. U-5557 surfaced. Only a very thin light line in the west indicated that the day, a successful one for us, had come to an end. Darkness hindered our sight. But the convoy could not run away. We were too close to its heels. With both engines full ahead, we pursued the battered herd. 2:05, we signalled headquarters, convoy grid square AM71, course 125. Sunk 3 14,000 tons light defence. Midnight. We turned to starboard and proceeded south. No convoy. 0032, we dived to sound out the depth. Reported the operator, propeller noise bearing 300 to 360, estimated distance 10 miles. 10 minutes later, U-557 surged back to the surface. Once again, the song of the engines together with the swishing noise of the sea rushing alongside the hull produced the hymn which accompanied us into battle. A flare fell in the east. 0115, destroyer 3,000 metres on port. We drew a big loop around the escort, swinging into the convoy's wake. It was as if we drove into nowhere. Sky and sea formed a solid black wall. 0220, 2 escorts shot out of the darkness, showing their white moustaches. "Alarm!" shouted Paulson. "Dive to 170. Hard left rudder." The furious commotion of our crash dive covered up the propeller noise of the destroyers, which were closing in on us with terrifying speed. We clung to pipes and equipment to hold our balance. That was how steeply U-557 hurtled into depth. Before the escorts could split her stern, she was already down to 90 metres. 2 charges erupted in our wake, flogging the boat like a gigantic whiplash. Total darkness enveloped us for long seconds. U-557 fell and fell. It seemed to be the end, but the lights came on again and Fader levelled the boat off at a depth of 200 metres. 0230. Both destroyers had stopped. Silence above, silence inside the hull. Our sound man reported other propellers approaching. The escorts had called for reinforcement. We braced for a long barrage. 0245. One escort began to run up on our port side. We veered at high speed to avoid her spread. Then we heard 3 splashes, soon followed by 3 infernal explosions. The well-placed cluster slammed our boat deeper. Hydraulic oil spouted across the control room. The steel groaned, motor relays tripped, planes and rudders jammed, deck plates jumped. As the echo of the booms subsided, someone threw the relays back in. The chief reduced the speed to silent running, and all was again quiet inside the iron drum. The well-trained destroyer crews above had stopped for a new probe into depth. 0318. Another attack began. 3 cruel detonations came at close intervals. Then another run. We sat at our stations in the twilight of our emergency lighting, biting our lips and holding our breath as the ASDIC pings grew unbearably loud. Some of the men lay on deck staring upward. Others were sitting and staring into an imaginary something. There was no talking, no coughing. The men showed no signs of desperation, only tiredness and stress. Hour after hour, the attacks were renewed sporadically and inaccurately. Depth was our prime advantage, our only protection. 1200. Above us they were still searching. The captain ordered fruit conserves and biscuits distributed, a healthy decision. The men relaxed a little as they took on nourishment. 1412. The latest barrage brought to 128 the number of canisters dropped upon us, but the sound man claimed that he heard 2 escorts leave the scene. We were hopeful. 1520. Not a single detonation for over 1 hour. Had the Tommies run out of depth charges? Had they abandoned their game? The sound operator turned his wheel with loving care. The entire horizon seemed to be free of hostile sound. Where was the third hunter? Paulson said, "Start up bilge pump. Let's see whether they take that bait." The impertinent grinding sound tortured us like a dentist's drill. Though it betrayed our position, it produced no response from above. The third enemy had also departed. 1610. U-557 surfaced after being submerged for 14 hours. As the captain opened the bridge hatch, I was literally thrown out of the hull by our internal pressure. Brilliant weather greeted us. We inhaled the fresh air gratefully, though a sudden abundance of it almost made us black out. The ventilators transported oxygen to the sweating hands inside the drum. For us on the bridge, the sun was never so red nor the sky so blue. Since the convoy had fled safely beyond our reach, U-557 raced west in search of new targets. We travelled 3 days, covering 450 miles in a medium sea. On the fourth night, a U-boat operating in the extreme north flashed a signal across the Atlantic. Convoy AJ. 35. Course east 12 knots. Attack. Taking the cue, we changed course and dashed into old, faraway hunting grounds. Simultaneously, other boats deciphered the message and raced to intercept the convoy. However, headquarters had other plans for E-557. We were instructed to proceed into a different area, leaving the loot to others. The boat's company cursed like pirates over spilled rum. As it turned out, a large wolf pack made contact with a Halifax convoy. One by one, their torpedoes crashed into its flanks and decimated it. Short signals came rushing in, proclaiming victory in one of the greatest battles ever fought in the Atlantic. Those messages, accumulating on the captain's desk, reflected the ferocity of the assault which sent ship after ship to her grave. The radiograms were as precise as the shots the captains fired. Torpedoes expended. Sunk 5 24,000 tons. Set for base. Sunk 3 18,000 tons. Damaged 2. Keep contact. 2 vessels sunk. Depth charge. Damages. Return to base. Have sunk 421,000. Continue hunt. The battle went on cruelly for 2 more nights and days. Through those hours of ruthless sinkings, we stayed tuned in on our German radio stations and listened to the special bulletins that informed the nation of our victory at sea. Then the wolves lost the convoy in the northern fog, leaving the bottom littered with 20 battered hulks. As one of the triumphant U-boats headed home, it crashed into another convoy, and at once a new hunt began. This time, U-557 was ordered to operate against the target. As we approached the northern region, the sea rose higher. Cold spray and foam and a slashing wind mauled me during my watch on the bridge. Visibility quickly dropped from 16 miles to 4. The typical North Atlantic weather caught up with us once again. U-557 beat the waves head-on and listed strongly in the long breakers as the chase went into its second day. Alarm! It was exactly 17:30. The boat tilted immediately and submerged fast. Paulson, racing into the control room, called into the tower, "Exec, what's the matter up there?" Kern replied through frozen lips, "Destroyer bearing 30, distance 4,000 meters." As soon as the chief had the boat under control, the sound man reported that high-pitched propellers were slowly disappearing. We had not been detected. The operator made another discovery. "Wide soundband port ahead. Must be a convoy." We had run into the starboard flank of an unreported convoy. Paulson ordered the crew on battle stations and the boat on periscope depth. The scope revealed nothing, so the captain brought us to the surface. As soon as the tower was clear, we rushed through cascading waves onto the platform. Visibility was only 2 miles. A thick layer of clouds hung just above the boiling sea. We immediately pushed after the source of the sound band. 40 minutes later, we again sighted an escort and quickly outmaneuvered her. The sea, rolling from west to east, drove us violently ahead as huge, long waves lifted our boat at her stern and carried her forward high on their crests. While in hot pursuit through a violet twilight, We informed Admiral U-boats of our discovery. It soon became apparent, however, that the convoy made drastic changes of course. We continued eastward for 2 hours in a huge zigzag pattern, but detected no convoy. Reluctantly, Paulson ordered the chief to dive to take a new sound check. The sound man reported a faint disturbance on starboard 40. We surfaced at once. Dusk had closed in and visibility was reduced to less than a mile. U-557 swayed and listed in a tumultuous sea. Sheets of water broke over the superstructure, lashing our faces and burning our eyes. I sought cover in a squatting position, with my glasses levelled over the rim of the bridge. But the fierce spray split my skin and lips, drenched the Turkish towel I had wrapped around my neck, and ran down my back into my boots. I shivered in the chill of the night despite my triple layer of clothing, topped by a one-piece diver's suit of thick rubber. U-557 kept thrusting toward the enemy. It was almost midnight when a shadow moved into my glasses. Then there were 2, 3, 4. Paulson saw them, and the exec also saw them. 2 escorts flitted nervously at the tail of the starboard column, and one zigzagged ahead of our boat, all of them unaware of our breakthrough. Huge shadows, giant cargo ships, pitched about unperturbed, their broad flanks inviting a shot. U-557 gradually swung into attack position. An escort broke toward us through the wall of darkness, but we eluded her by sneaking close to a huge freighter. Paulson pushed into the herd from astern. No enemy eye could spot our boat in the high, windswept whirlpool. As Paulson steered tenaciously in between 2 columns, the fat shadows grew monstrous. The captain shouted into the raging storm, "Exec, pick your targets, make it quick, we can shoot only once." "Have them all on a string. Tubes 1 to 5 ready. Ready." "Hard right rudder," Paulson screamed. "Shoot, exec." Seconds later, 2 torpedoes leapt out of their tubes. Quickly another fan shot left the boat against an overlapping target. Finally, the last torpedo churned toward the nearest shadow in the column. Then there was breathless waiting. 3 hard explosions bellowed into the night. 3 volcanoes erupted almost simultaneously. 3 sharp shocks rocked the boat. Dozens of star. Shells climbed into the sky and countless parachute flares hung in the clouds, illuminating the wild seascape with a ghastly green and yellow glare. We had long since escaped the scene of disaster when 2 escorts arrived to rescue survivors. The impact upon the enemy was so severe, the confusion so great, that no serious counteraction followed. As a result, we risked staying on the surface to reload the tubes. We clung to the convoy, carefully holding our distance behind the shadows. The stricken convoy had made a sharp turn to the north, but the wolf was still within the flock. Some distance to the south, 3 vessels lost their struggle, and the last flickering flames were swallowed by the violent sea. 40 minutes after the attack, our last 2 torpedoes were ready for use. 7557 closed the gap. Minutes later we had the targets before our tubes, dead ahead. With the rudder turned hard, our boat surged in an arc into proper position. Then 2 brief commands, 2 light shocks, and the last torpedoes sprang from their tubes. The captain said, "That's all, gentlemen. Both engines emergency ahead, hard right rudder. Set course 180. U-557 turned away and escaped at top speed." We watched the targets for 60 seconds, 70 seconds. We counted and waited and hoped. But the 2 torpedoes were failures. During those moments between life and death, I pictured the seamen on their doomed vessels, riding the huge waves, holding on to life rafts. I felt sorry for those courageous men who had to suffer and go down with their ship. It was a terrible ending of a hopeless struggle. I could understand why the British seamen persisted. They were fighting for the very existence of their country. But I was bewildered by the stubbornness of the captains and crews from foreign lands. Why did they continue sailing for the British, defying our torpedoes and the growing ferocity of the battles? Whatever price the British had paid for their services, it could not have been enough to compensate for their risks and very lives. I was astounded that His Majesty's Admiralty was still able to recruit any number of foreign ships. 30 minutes after our last attack, we informed headquarters of our night's encounter and advised that we would be sending beacon signals to home other wolves toward the herd. For 3 hours, we remained in cautious proximity to the convoy, transmitting the beacons vital to the continuation of the battle. Then 2 detonations, accompanied by 2 fire fountains in the front half of the convoy, indicated that another U-boat had arrived. Our mission was completed. At 05:30, U-557 dived into secure depth. There the captain had a surprise for us. The sinking of 6 ships called for the opening of some medicine bottles that had been kept under lock and key. With cup in hand, each man filed through the narrow aisle, halted at the captain's tiny corner for as long as it took him to pour a rare shot of cognac. Then we retreated to our stations or bunks, sipping the potent liquid. After 20 hours of running submerged, U-557 surfaced and set course for the Bay of Biscay. Our second patrol, which ended on September 18th, had produced a different kind of crew. We were now seasoned warriors in the powerful force that had reshaped Europe in just 2 years. Our hit-and-destroy operation against the major convoy we had discovered had been an important contribution to the inevitable defeat of England. We ourselves had sunk 3 ships of the convoy, bringing our total to 6 and 32,000 tons. Our attack was continued by other U-boats, which sank 6 more vessels in less than 4 days. Moreover, this engagement broadened into a great 12-day battle against 3 convoys crossing the North Atlantic in staggered pattern. Altogether, our U-boats had hit the incredible number of 20 ships out of the first convoy, 4 out of the second, and 9 out of the third, making a total of 33 ships totaling at least 165,000 tons, all sunk within 2 weeks. These extraordinary sinkings proved again the great potential of our wolf-pack tactic, which left the British defence helpless and turned the Atlantic and the waters around England into a graveyard for Allied shipping. We had, indeed, reason to feel proud. As victorious veterans, we took for granted the hearty reception that greeted us at the quay in Lorient. The cheering crowd, the flowers, the brassy band music, the respectful salutes of the flotilla's commandant and his staff, all this was our due. The only unexpected bonus was the bold appearance of the girls from the établissements, who could not resist the temptation to welcome home their best customers. A night filled with warm embraces made a pleasant prospect for our crewmen, but even this had become just another routine part of the sailor's life. Our first duty after landing was to attend the usual ceremonial dinner at the prefecture. The meal was a long and rich one, laced successively with champagne, red wine, and German beer. When the speeches ended and the men dispersed to their respective quarters, I was sent back on board U-557 to take charge of the watch the first night in port. The boat lay like a phantom in the low tide. My 3 guards stood on deck enjoying the lukewarm night. I went below, into the stifling stench of oil, grease, sweat, and decaying food. The sudden calm and motionless state of the boat that had rocked and pitched and had spread death and destruction for almost 50 days was a new sensation. I realized how important this delicate instrument had become to me. Its power was now a vital part of my life, if not a part of myself. Knowing that I would have very little time later, I sat down on the captain's green leather mattress, switched on a small headlamp over his narrow desk, and wrote my letters home. My night watch ended early. It was barely morning when workmen came aboard and began stripping U-557 of all moving parts in preparation for her transfer to dry dock for refitting. The crew, the majority just back from the établissements, set themselves up in the old naval complex in quarters that had been greatly improved while we were at sea. I found that my living conditions were even better. The flotilla had assigned me a large room in the local Hotel Beau Séjour, and my luggage was already there when I arrived. For the first time since we sailed, I was able to take a shave and hot shower. After washing away my filth and smell, I rolled myself in white, fresh-smelling linen, spread out in my huge bed, and fell into a long sleep. Our first 3 days in port gave us just enough time to recuperate and prepare ourselves for the obligatory meeting with Admiral Donitz. Again, the ceremony took place in the sun-drenched plaza in front of the prefecture, with the band playing a march and a large number of high officers in attendance. Donitz showered us with iron crosses and took time to pin a medal on my chest. That day in late September was significant for another reason. After the ceremony on the plaza, my classmates Gerloff and Goebel were informed of their immediate transfer to U-boat school. The day had started out as a happy one, but this news dampened our enthusiasm. In the evening, the three of us had a fine dinner in town to celebrate our decorations and their new assignment as well. We toasted one another and promised to sink many more enemy ships before the war would end. My friends departed on the morning train. I never met them again. Both found their graves in different places in the Atlantic. For each, the first patrol after school became the last. The departure of my friends was not the only bitter pill to swallow. About the same time, the good news from the Atlantic and Eastern fronts was mixed with word of 2 important U-boat casualties. Long after it actually happened, headquarters reluctantly announced that U-47, with her famous Captain Gwenther Prien in command, had been attacked while pursuing a convoy and sunk by a British destroyer. Prien was known as the Bull of Scapa Flow because he had dared to enter the British Home Fleet's sanctuary in 1939. Here he had sunk the battleship Royal Oak and damaged the seaplane carrier Pegasus. Prien was stopped after having sunk almost 200,000 gross weight tons of Allied shipping. Also lost was U-556 under the command of much-decorated Captain Wolfart. She had been wrecked by a heavy depth charge series, but her captain and most of her crew had been rescued by the 3 attacking British destroyers. Wolfart, too, was one of the aces with more than 100,000 tons to his credit. It seemed to me that men like Wolfart and Prien could not be replaced, yet the U-boat war was creating aces much faster than it destroyed them. Now that I was the only ensign aboard U-557, triple duty fell upon my shoulders. As work on the boat proceeded rapidly, my days were filled with responsible tasks. I got no help from the captain, who quickly departed for Lake Constance and home, or from his classmate Kelbling, who left our company 4 days after our return, or from the exec and Siebold, who hurried off on a 2-week leave. But my labours were not without reward. In the evenings, I walked through the streets of Lorient, enjoying my solitude, or retreated into a cosy restaurant, supplementing the sailor's ration at the base with a delicious dinner, and some of those lukewarm nights made perfect covers for my escapades. By the time the crew began to reassemble, however, I had my fill of the pleasures of liberty in port. On October 8th, U-557 set out for the 3rd time, again heading for the North Atlantic. After a few days of calm sailing, we left the Bay of Biscay astern and encountered high seas. Summer had ended, and the first gale winds of autumn lashed the waves to tremendous heights. Under a sky thick with dark clouds, the mountainous waves toyed with our boat, tossed her wildly, and kept the bridge half filled with water. U-557 worked frantically to stay on course and make headway. On the 6th day of our patrol, we reached a position approximately 300 miles west-southwest of the North Channel. That afternoon, as we traversed our old hunting grounds, I was put in charge of the 3rd watch, part of the greater responsibilities that the captain now entrusted to me. The watch was a harsh one. The gale, whipping the water to a milky froth, crusted our eyes and noses with salt. Our binoculars were useless. After 3 hours on the bridge, I spotted a destroyer moving into our starboard aft quarter. I immediately pointed our stern toward the grey menace, increased speed, and informed Paulson. I assumed the ship was a part of the convoy's defence. The captain arrived in a hurry, secured his steel belt to a clamp at the superstructure, and put both diesels into high gear. Following orders to concentrate on supply-bearing freighters, Paulson wasted no torpedoes on the destroyer but sped away from her. Within minutes, the bouncing ship had fallen back to the horizon. For 2 hours we tracked the escort's evasive manoeuvres, hoping she would reveal the whereabouts of the convoy. At 15:20, Wiesner, who continually plotted the enemy's zigzags, identified a general westward path. The convoy had to be south of the escort. After another hour of battling giant waves, we saw a smoke-blackened cloud on port. Once again we began the hunt, keeping contact with the steaming herd at a distance of 10 miles. When Wiesner relieved me on the bridge, I lowered myself into the tower, then dropped into the hull. Here, in humidity of 100%, with the waves showering salt water through the hatch onto the metal deck, I went to work feverishly at the chart table, plotting course. Condensing moisture dripped from overhead plates, pipes and ducts onto charts and paper. My parallel ruler did not slide, nor my pencil write. Water sloshed around my feet to the rhythm of the boat's rocking. At 2000, I again took my place in the starboard front nook of the bridge. The captain was at my back. Suddenly a searchlight, very faint, beamed into the dusk in the southwest. For seconds only. We chased after the clue. 40 minutes later, shadows loomed ahead, feeble, unreal. A quick correction of course, and we surged forward on a parallel track with the convoy. Our powerful glasses revealed the classic picture of dim freighters wallowing in the blackness. We counted 17 cargo ships, but there had to be more behind the rain squall. We detected an escort, port astern, and kept her under close surveillance. The captain held his boat at a constant distance while we established all target values for a midnight attack. We charged forward, spreading foam and spray, breathing air full of smoke and soot. The wind howled and the waves thundered above the clatter of our engines as we raced past the shadows and outmanoeuvred 2 escorts with ease. The sea swallowed our small steel drum. Only the tip of the bridge protruded. Now we stood in the horseshoe up to our necks in water, tied to the boat with wide steel belts. The phantoms rocked in several columns westward, their broad flanks exposed temptingly. Through the savage wind and throbbing engine noise, I heard shouted commands and bellowing reports from below. The exec clung to the TBT to hold himself erect while aiming through it at the numerous targets. The final moment had come for some of the giants and for those who manned them. "Open fire!" screamed Paulson, the storm tearing his order from his mouth. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" shouted the exec. "Hard left rudder, steer 250, hollered the captain and slammed the cover of the voice tube shut. Long seconds ticked away. A blast, a fireball, then a loud detonation. A huge fountain rose over the dying vessel. A second bolt, a boom, a terrifying shriek. Then a third explosion, a flaming jet. Large chunks of steel hurled into the illuminated clouds. The bow of a 7,000-ton freighter broke off. The ship drifted, burning furiously amid the convoy, and was avoided only with difficulty by hard rudder manoeuvres of the vessels following. Erupting star shells and the roaring of heavy guns mingled with exploding cargoes and unfolding parachute flares to turn the night into a bright inferno. A destroyer, rushing north to the aid of the 3 victims, threatened to cross our track at close range. 17-557 swerved, showing her tail, and was carried away in long lifts, lashed at by the waves. The unexpected interference caused us to lose sight of the 2 dying vessels, and we were unable to witness their demise. 1 hour of pursuit revealed no trace of a ship. It was as if the convoy had sprouted wings. We dived for a sound check, but adverse water conditions swallowed every sound. After surfacing again, Paulson followed a hunch and directed the boat into a southwesterly track. Dawn arrived, and with the new day came a stiff breeze. It chased the clouds low and pitched the spray high. Visibility changed rapidly from 0 to 3 miles and back to 0 again. We hunted all day without spotting a trace of a ship. But at dusk there was a sudden detonation in the port quarter ahead. A second one followed. Typical torpedo hits. Another wolf had found the herd. Sweeping star shells showed us the way to the targets. 1 hour and 16 miles later, we detected the first shadow. We followed the Phantom for 20 minutes, allowing the exec to obtain new target values. Suddenly, heavy fog rolled in, and the target dissolved. Just as suddenly, a freighter appeared and bore down on us. "Shadow bearing 240!" cried someone. The ship's huge bow moved toward us, so close that we could only shoot and run. The command came, "Tube 5, fire!" and our boat turned to starboard just in time to avoid ramming the freighter. We waited 40 seconds, 60 seconds. The torpedo was a miss. 3 vessels, spewing black clouds of soot, rose like mountains in front of our tubes. I could almost hear the throbbing of their piston engines. Poulsen shouted over his shoulder, "Exec, let them have what they deserve!" Kern rapped out his orders in short spurts. 3 torpedoes fanned out. 2 explosions ripped the night, then the pressure waves hit our faces. 2 flashes blinded us for seconds. The scene was drenched in daylight as 2 cargo ships sent flames skyward. One ship turned wildly in a circle, her rudder jammed. Both listed and sank within minutes, before their crews had time to lower the life rafts. A flash came from one of the shadowy cargo ships. We had sailed too close to her in our excitement, and a few ant-like figures on the aft deck had manned a cannon and were shooting at us. 2, 3, 4 tall fountains rose around our boat. Several shells screamed over our heads. Speeding away from the spitting freighter, we hid behind a curtain of smoke and dropped to the end of the wounded herd. 1 hour later, torpedoes were hoisted into the tubes. 17 to 557 reduced the distance to the convoy, then raced into it again, splitting it open from astern. 2 merchantmen, still unaware of our presence, continued on their rigid course. "Sink those monsters, exec!" shouted Poulsen. 2 shots were fired in an instant. U-557 swung into a loop, quivered under the hard waves, then raced away. After 2 minutes we realized that the torpedoes had missed. Poulsen curbed his anger and steered his boat into a fresh assault. "Destroyer bearing 220!" The high ship came charging out of nowhere, her bow rising knife-like in the blackness. Poulsen bent over the hatch and hollered, "Attention, Chief! Give us full power or an escort is going to bite off our stern." He squeezed his boat between 2 cargo ships, but the destroyer clung to our tail, a mere 200-odd metres astern. There was no chance to dive with safety. The captain made quick manoeuvres around a few bows and sterns, then a fast dash into the night through the furious seas. Death did not claim us. The good Lord had put his thumb between the hunter and the hunted. After our escape, we returned to the attack but found no trace of the convoy. Dawn came at 06:15, and we were alone in a water desert. The men, tired and disappointed, dozed or ate on battle stations. Food tasted awful. Bread had become mildewy, salami had turned green and slimy, and we washed down the battle sandwiches with a coffee that the Café Burger in Frankfurt could not have reproduced. Sweat, condensate and salt water had soaked our clothes, diluted the food and made everything clammy and sticky. We were drowsy from the boat's perpetual motion, weak in our knees, numb from cold, and almost deaf from the everlasting thunder of the diesel engines, the wind and ocean. But the hunt went on. "Smoke clouds on port!" The cry from the bridge excited the last man in the farthest compartment. Aching bodies rose and were instantly ready for action. As dusk closed in, we took on the convoy expecting nothing but success. It was the giddy sensation we always felt before an attack. Soon the misty, dirty night limited our vision, but we saw a ghostly escort moving across our wake at high speed. Then 3, 4 cargo ships materialized on starboard, all in perfect position for our attack. A fast command, a hard rudder manoeuvre, then came Poulsen's call, "Shoot, exec! I can't hold this course much longer." Years of glory. Kern swiveled the TBT, his aim hampered by the rampaging sea. "Hell, get the eels out of the tubes!" The captain slammed his order into Kern's face. The exec, his hands clamped around the steel support of the TBT and his head pressed against the rubber cushion of the night binocular, swiveled again, focused, then screamed the orders that released 2 torpedoes. U-557 listed sharply as she described a short curve to port. An explosion, a hit. One ship broke instantly behind the bridge. The second torpedo hit. The second victim listed to starboard, feverishly burning, her deck slipping closer to surface. The gale wind carried to us the stench of the explosions, the stink of burning cargo, the smoke of coal-fired boilers. The tubes now had to be recharged. U-557 dropped astern of the convoy, secured herself from a surprise attack, and wallowed incapacitated for an hour while our last torpedoes were hoisted into the tubes. Afterward, we resumed the chase. At dawn, the convoy was still far ahead. With the day came the rains. All morning and half of the afternoon they whipped our faces and washed away the salt crusts. The convoy, meanwhile, had disappeared behind the low-hanging clouds. At 1845, a destroyer floated into view. We kept her under careful surveillance and tenaciously followed her course. 2.5 hours after nightfall, we again sighted freighters, 3 shadows listing in the turbulent waters. U-557 closed the gap. A 7,000-ton vessel became Kern's target, and the torpedo hissed out of the tube. The ship nosed under instantly with a crashing boom, and as her stern reared up, we saw the propeller turning its last dying revolutions. Immediate counteraction, long-lasting flares hung in the dirty sky, their glare so brilliant that I could count the whiskers on the captain's face. And there, not far on port, the breaking ship shrieked in her last convulsive agony. Paulson manoeuvred through the columns cleverly and soon reached the dark section of the parade. The flares attracted an escort. She stopped near the sinking ship and began taking aboard survivors. She was an easy target, but an unwritten law prohibited attacks on ships engaged in rescue operations. And so Paulson broke into the herd again. He was in high spirits. This battle went his way. He dictated the terms. After 90 minutes of pursuit, run-off and re-entry, we managed to break into the centre of the remaining ships. A 10,000-ton monster was Paulson's target. We had but one precious torpedo left in the aft tube. U-557 slammed against the waves as she struggled into attack position. Somehow the exec's order to fire was heard above the raging gust. The last torpedo streaked toward the Phantom. A quick getaway, a run into the wall of the night. But as hard as we listened and strained our eyes and hoped, there was no hit. The battle had come to an end. U-557 left the convoy the same hour, our course set for the Bay of Biscay and port. Later, we dived to give the crew a well-deserved rest. Only a few hands stayed awake to keep the boat afloat. For hours there was absolute peace. The only sounds heard aboard were the soft humming of the electric motors and the tiny thuds of the condensate drops hitting the deck plates. Our latest toll, harvested from a single convoy, was 6 ships sunk and 2 more possibly destroyed. These triumphs were matched and surpassed by several other U-boats, whose radio reports we picked up on our way back to Lorient. U-707, a somewhat larger boat, had cost enemy shipping over 100,000 tons on a single operation. All told, ships totalling more than 160,000 tons were destroyed in October, and 200,000 gross weight tons had been sent to the bottom in September. In London that fall of 1941, a record amount of tonnage had to be stricken from Lloyd's Register. It was a hard time for the maritime insurance business. On October 27th, U-557 sailed into Lorient harbour. A gay crowd awaited us. This time, however, the girls from the etablissements were not among the well-wishers. As we learned later, the naval complex had been fenced off against unauthorised personnel. But after our usual welcome home dinner and a thorough washing, a good portion of our men found their French girls holding open house in the downtown bordellos. Most of the men were not seen on the base before réveillé the next morning. On the afternoon of November 3rd, the crew again assembled in the large square of the prefecture. Admiral Dönitz had come from his command post to greet us. Again he dispensed medals with a lavish hand. I watched proudly, unaware that these were my last minutes as a member of the crew of U-55E7. After the affair, Paulson broke the news that I was transferred to the 1st U-boat flotilla in Brest, the largest port on the coast of Brittany. It was a hard blow. Only reluctantly did I accept the order that separated me from my many friends and from the boat on which I had found my cause. The wonderful camaraderie that had united enlisted men and officers was suddenly, for me, a thing of the past. I no longer belonged. As I said goodbye to captain and crew, I saw traces of moisture in several eyes. That day was the last time that I shook the hands of those men, those dear comrades who had escaped death with me so often. U-5557 left Lorient on November 19th for the Mediterranean. She succeeded in breaking through the Strait of Gibraltar, where the British had set up a tight blockade, and crowned her career with the sinking of the British cruiser Galatea near Alexandria. But U-5557 met her fate on December 16th in the ironic form of an Italian destroyer, the Orione, a ship of a friendly nation, which accidentally rammed her in the Sea of Crete. U-5557 went to the bottom, carrying her whole crew down into eternal entombment. On November 5th, I was chauffeured by a Russian immigrant driver across the sun-drenched landscape of Brittany. As our Citroën chased down the highway, the needle of the speedometer often crept over the 120-kilometre mark. Speed and sun and the beautiful countryside soon changed my mood. It was exhilarating to come back from the inferno at sea and find myself flying across a foreign world full of marvels. Nonetheless, I was relieved to step out of the car when it careened to a stop at the gate of the 1st U-boat flotilla in Brest. Before me, overlooking the bay, lay a sprawling granite complex. Some of the buildings were not yet completed. The stately structures had been built to house the French Naval Academy, but our conquest of France had put a halt to the college programme. Instead of French enthusiasts, German U-boat aces had moved into the quarters. I reported briskly to the adjutant of the flotilla. He told me that I would soon have to attend U-boat school. The winter term was about to begin. This was disappointing news. However, I had no objection to a few days of idleness after 6 months of extraordinary activity. I established myself in a room with a breathtaking view of the harbour and Crozon Peninsula. Then I went out to explore the town. Brest, I had been warned, was a hotbed of espionage and sabotage. Occasionally, too, members of the French resistance abducted or murdered our men. But the city was busy and peaceful. Its cafes, bistros, and shops were gay and thriving, and the presence of countless Germans in uniform offered added reassurance. It was a sunny November day. The scent of fall was in the air, and I resolved to enjoy myself to the fullest. After a delicious seafood dinner, I walked through the picturesque streets, stopped at this cafe or that, and browsed through every bookstore I passed. In one of these shops I saw Yvonne. She worked there. Her blonde hair and blue eyes attracted me at once. I asked her for some books that she could not possibly have, and managed to engage her in a conversation that ended with a dinner date for the following evening. The next day, fearing that sudden transfer orders would spoil my plans, I left the base early and spent another pleasant afternoon wandering through Brest. Before the time to meet Yvonne, I was waiting impatiently for her in a bistro across from the city hall. She was graceful, fragile, and afraid. Her only contact with a German, she said, had been an occasional remark over the counter on the subject of books. But soon she found herself in an unpatriotic tête-à-tête with one of the intruders in the obscure light of an exclusive restaurant. Dinner was excellent. Dessert was sweetened by her promise to see me again. The evening ended, much too soon, and, to my great disappointment, at the fence surrounding her house on the other side of town. I met Yvonne again the following evening, not during daylight, for she did not wish to be seen in public with me. At her gate after sunset, under the protection of the growing darkness, she was not so afraid any more. From then on, I was a regular guest at Yvonne's home. Whenever I went to her, I secured my gun at my belt, determined to meet Yvonne and not my executioner, a member of the Maquis, in a lonely alley of Brest. Whenever I slipped out of Yvonne's home, it was sunrise, never before, for I wanted a clear view of anyone who might be following me through the streets of Brest. I never asked Yvonne more than I needed to know. She said that she loved me, and that was all I wished to hear. In turn, I promised her everything for the love she so graciously spent on me. I enjoyed these days of sunshine and autumn flowers, but after 2 weeks came the task of telling Yvonne about my new command. We vowed to see each other again as soon as I would return. I hoped to be back in the spring, when the cherry blossoms would be in bloom. The last I saw of her was her bright scarf disappearing in the night as my train pulled out of the station. Arriving at the Gare de Montparnasse, I decided impulsively to stay in Paris that day and take the evening train to Germany. I rushed through the Louvre, walked down the Champs-Élysées, stood at the Place de l'Étoile, surveyed the city from the top of the Eiffel Tower, and sat in the Café de la Paix watching a brilliant new world go by. When the church bells rang out the day, I had barely sampled the pearl of all cities. Next morning it was cool and misty as my train crossed the Rhine. But the sun had burned off the fog by the time the express hurtled through the pine woods south of Frankfurt. No one greeted me in the main station, for I had not announced my arrival. This was the way I wanted it. I was no friend of sentimental receptions in public. Not far from the station plaza was my parents' home in a quiet, tree-lined street. As I turned into the familiar avenue, I saw a pair of pretty legs not far ahead. I looked again, then realized they were my sisters. I said but one word, "Trudy." She spun around and clutched me. Her tears moistened my cheeks. "Why didn't you let us know that you were coming? We would have been at the station. You look good. You have lost weight, though, haven't you?" "I don't think so. It's only because you haven't seen me for a year. Tell me, how is father? How is mother doing?" Trudy tried to tell me all the news in the few minutes it took to reach home. Mother was full of joy. 1 year and 100 imagined deaths lay between us and my last leave. She did not ask about my war. Her interest was aimed at my health and my appetite. "You could have sent us a telegram and I would have a cake for you today." That morning the cake was baked anyhow. I talked to father on the phone. He closed his office for the rest of the day and made the short walk home in a hurry. His welcome was hearty, and we pressed each other's hand like two old soldiers. "Hello, son. How long does your leave last this time?" "I am not on leave, father. Just passing through on the way to the Baltic. I have no more than 30 hours to spend." "That's unfortunate. Let me see how we can make these few hours most comfortable for you." Then he began asking me questions. How had I earned my decoration? What is a convoy battle really like? How do depth charges affect boat and company? He was eager to hear my view of our progress against the British, and he wanted to know all I could tell him about my patrols. Gradually our discussion veered to a point that seemed to be of great concern to him. "Don't you think we are spreading our forces rather thinly over the continent?" "It seems to me we have sufficient manpower to cover the occupied areas." "But how many more fronts can we possibly afford?" he asked cautiously. There was no answer, and the question made me vaguely uneasy. I steered the conversation back to happier subjects. That evening at home and the next were deeply satisfying. Home meant security, an island of rest and intimacy amid the disorder of war. Despite my father's persistent queries, I said little about the U-boats and my feelings in combat. I wished to leave them with the impression that my work was not deadly and tragic, that I would always return. When my train arrived in the capital, icy and violent gusts were blowing in from the northeast. Marianne was at the station, punctual as always. We walked through the almost deserted streets to the plush Hotel Fürstenhof, where I had chosen to stay. The hotel was far better and costlier than the modest accommodations we had to put up with during my last stop, but with my increase in pay I could afford it. And Marianne was different too, somehow less reserved. Her caresses made me forget that there was war and that I had been in battle all summer and fall. The brutal world ceased to exist in her embrace, and an air raid warning went unheard. During the 2 days of my visit, we rushed from one entertainment to another. To the dismay of the critics, the war had curtailed Berlin's cultural life and lowered the standard of theatrical and operatic performances. Another notable casualty was the quality of the meals offered in restaurants on Kurfürstendamm. No, Berlin was not the same. But my warm Marianne made the cold city beautiful, and I was sorry, perhaps too sorry, to pack up again and kiss her goodbye. The temperature was minus 15 degrees centigrade when I arrived in Königsberg on the last day in November. Shivering in my light uniform, I caught a local train to Pillau, a small port on the Baltic. The compartment was like an icebox, and when I reached my destination, I was almost frozen stiff. It was midnight when I boarded the luxury liner Pretoria, the residence of the 1st U-boat Training Division. At breakfast, there was a grand reunion. I shook hands with many a classmate and celebrated many a Wiedersehen at the bar. We had come from all over Europe. We had fought far-flung battles and sunk a gratifying number of Allied ships. 7 months lay between our graduation party in April and this bitter cold first day in December. For most of us, 7 months of U-boat war had passed without serious injury. This was reason enough to celebrate. Our rigorous training began under severe handicaps. Pillau harbour was covered with ice, in some places up to 30 centimetres thick, and icebreakers worked continually to keep a channel open to minor traffic, giving our U-boats access to the Baltic. We went to sea day and night, with each of us alternately assuming the duties of engineer and captain. Our teachers, experienced commanders, taught us all the new tricks of surface attacks at night and submerged assaults by day. Diving manoeuvres were deliberately fouled up, so that we sweated blood to keep the boats afloat. Soon we could perform routine and emergency drills in our sleep. Some of us almost did, for we never had enough rest to recuperate from the harsh exercises of the previous day. But there were also easy days. The commandant of the flotilla, Schuhart, a decorated U-boat ace who had sunk the British aircraft carrier Courageous in 1939, was a superior teacher whose lessons were attended eagerly. The weekends I spent aboard the Pretoria, enjoying a book, playing cards, or discussing Japan's reasons for attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advances in the Philippines and in the Pacific were too far away to be of any great interest to us. I was aware, however, that events in the Pacific would profoundly influence the U-boat war in the Atlantic. With the full involvement of the United States in the hostilities, and particularly in our fight at sea, the outlook for the future changed almost overnight. I prepared myself for a long war. Nonetheless, the battle in the Atlantic still went well, and we had reason to be confident of ultimate victory. Our radio networks sounded frequent fanfares and kept public count of enemy ships sent to the bottom. Almost 3 million gross weight tons had been sunk in 1941. The British were still unable to counteract our mounting pressure. Entire convoys were virtually abandoned to our wolves. We continued to suffer losses, though. In December, another ace was lost around Gibraltar. Captain Lieutenant Endras and his U-567, destroyers of more than 200,000 tons of enemy shipping, had been sunk without survivors. Our tough training in Pillau went on through January of 1942. Early in February, I was sent to the Naval Academy in Flensburg to attend torpedo school. 6 weeks of classes and practice shooting taught me the latest secrets. Courses in U-boat tactics and radio communication followed as winter slackened its grip. With the arrival of spring, I was promoted to lieutenant while attending gunnery school. As spring came, I eagerly awaited orders to return to combat. Remembering Yvonne with some complacence, I hoped to be sent back to Brest. Admiral U-boats, however, had other plans for Lieutenant Werner. I was instructed to go to Danzig and report aboard U-612 as executive officer. I read the teletype twice before I comprehended. It was indeed a fact that I was to become the first officer, second in command only to the captain, aboard a new submarine. The dim prospect of becoming a U-boat commander had suddenly moved within my reach. I arrived in Danzig on May 19th and reported aboard U-612. My boat, new but already weather-beaten, swayed alongside an old stone jetty. A guard told me that the captain was below. I lowered myself into the ship. Its familiar and obnoxious smell was suddenly inspiring. I found the captain in his nook and said, "I beg to report for duty, sir." "Welcome aboard. I am Oberleutnant Siegmann. I have been waiting for you since yesterday. We are ready to clear port. Come over here, please. I wish you to meet the other gentlemen of U-612. The captain, a stocky officer with reddish-blonde hair, had the look of an old seafarer and seemed to be about 7 years my senior. I followed him into the tiny officer's wardroom and was introduced to the chief and the second watch officer. We traded a few pleasantries, and they told me of the boat's history. She had been commissioned in Hamburg, the captain's hometown, in the previous December, and had been in hard training since then. Siegmann expected to finish the mandatory shakedown exercises within 3 months, which would qualify boat and crew for battle. I learned that the previous first officer had been relieved of his post due to poor health. The black-haired chief, Lieutenant Friedrich, was a married man 1 year my senior. Surprisingly, the second watch officer, Lieutenant Riedel, was a classmate of mine. Both men lacked battle experience, and that was the chief reason for my transfer. Although the captain had served as a prospective commander on a U-boat patrol in the Atlantic, only 1/3 of the ship's company had tasted combat. The rest had to be trained for their first mission. I introduced myself to the chief petty officers who had long service records. Then I retreated with my new captain into his corner, and he gave me a brief but firm idea of what he expected. As executive officer of U-612, I was to be her torpedo and artillery officer. I was to shoot when attacking on surface and to oversee firing when submerged. I was also to attend to the crew's well-being as the captain's deputy. The fact that I was given the exec's position in preference to my classmate Riedel was based solely upon my war experience, nothing more. Riedel and I had a frank talk later in the wardroom. We agreed to respect each other's position and to fight the enemy, not each other. The chat initiated a long friendship, which ended, as usual, with a death. U-612 sailed that day for the Gila Peninsula. There I made accommodations for the crew in the neat one-story barracks that were spotted among the evergreens in the white sand dunes. U-612 continued her rigid training with 6 weeks of torpedo practice. Day after day we put to sea as early as 700, and 1 hour later I was shooting at targets. We changed the routine in the afternoon, and Siegmann emptied the tubes, simulating a submerged attack. Stripped of torpedoes, we raced into port to take on a new load. Then we repeated the entire program in the dark, releasing the last torpedoes around midnight. The crew worked zealously, almost without rest or interruption, 6 days a week. During those 6 weeks, I compiled a sound record. I learned to shoot the torpedoes at the targets and not out to sea. Early in July, we wound up our most taxing exercises. U-612 soon was attached to another division, and an easier routine replaced the feverish activity at Hela. We sailed to a pier in Gotenhafen, a port in the Bay of Danzig, and I moved the crew into solid masonry quarters. Our interests now turned in a different direction. Summer had arrived, and I had not seen a girl for 6 weeks or more. However, women were plentiful only a 20-minute train ride away, in the famous sea resort of Sopot across the bay. I spent the weekends in Sopot's luxurious casino, in the cafes and on the beaches. I arranged and attended parties, won and lost girls, and generally harvested the good life before death could harvest me. While U-612 and her crew were preparing for battle, our armies drove ever deeper into enemy territory. Leningrad had been surrounded, though it still held out stubbornly. Sevastopol in the Crimea had capitulated. Our fast-moving divisions had reached the Caucasus, had occupied Rostov on the Don River, and were storming toward the rich oil fields near Maikop. In North Africa, Rommel had led his Africa Corps to victory after victory over the Tommies. He had taken El Alamein in the Libyan desert and was pushing hard against the Nile. In the Atlantic, our U-boats ravaged Britain's convoys with increasing ferocity, despite the entry of the United States into the war. Our U-boat operations were extended to America's east coast against little or no opposition. From Nantucket to Hatteras, from Florida to the Windward Islands, our torpedoes shattered the silence of peaceful commerce. Between Boston and New York, before Jacksonville, Miami, Havana, New Orleans, and Corpus Christi, near Barranquilla, Maracaibo, and Port of Spain, Barbados and Guadeloupe, U-boats attacked the Allied shipping routes, burned, torpedoed, shelled, and sunk a fortune of ships. During those months, some 2.5 million tons, over 500 vessels, including 140 tankers, were sent to the bottom. The golden age of U-boat war had arrived. The spirit of our crews in training soared to new heights. I myself, however, was in a state of constant irritation over our long, drawn-out exercises. I wanted to go back to the attack, to sink my own ships, to revive the victory celebrations. But my limited patience was to be put to further tests. The disastrous August 6th almost sank my ambitions. As always, U-612 cleared port by 0800. The bay was flat and reflected the sun like a mirror. The day promised to be another hot one. Well over 20 U-boats in their light grey paint headed into their designated squares, their wake sparkling in the clear air. The city of Danzig lay on starboard, its many old steeples and towers pointing into an immaculate blue sky. Our navigator Prager continuously took bearings from points on land. After 2 hours of small talk, most of us having returned late from our pleasures in Sopot, Prager informed me that we had arrived in our square. The captain was called to the bridge and we began our daily routine. The seamen, divided into 3 watches, took turns exercising on the heavy gun while we made simulated diving manoeuvres and surface attacks. At 1100, U-612 dived. We cruised at 3 knots at a depth of 25 metres. I was in the forward compartment teaching torpedo science to a large part of the crew, plus 12 prospective U-boat men who had been taken aboard to get their first feeling of being submerged. At 11:42, the boat was suddenly struck astern. The force of impact lifted her high up, then flung her to starboard. Instinctively, I knew that we had been hit by another submerged U-boat. I hollered, "Don life preservers, all men into the control room," and ran aft until I was stopped in the diesel compartment by a tremendous water jet. U-612 was sinking. I saw some men trapped in the stern torpedo room and shouted, "Get out of there or you will never get out alive." They hesitated for a moment, then all of them surged through the waterfall. The boat filled fast and tilted down strongly astern. I managed to clear the rear compartments, slammed the doors in the bulkheads watertight, then raced into the control room, closing the round hatch behind me. Meanwhile, Siegmann had ordered the chief to surface. Friedrich kept the lines blowing, allowing compressed air to flow into all buoyancy tanks to hold the boat afloat and permit the men to escape the hull. The captain on the bridge directed his wounded boat toward the coast, 4 endless miles to the south. I ordered life preservers distributed and pushed the guests up the aluminum ladder. For a second I could see the round opening in the tower and the blue sky above. I felt a desperate urge to race up the ladder, but duty condemned me to ride it out below with the chief, and probably to die with him. With one eye I watched the swinging depth-gauge needle. With the other I watched the men abandon ship. Soon the boat would be too heavy astern and fall away like a rock, taking all of us down to the bottom. I muttered angrily, "Verdammt, in a minute more we could all get out of this coffin." Then I spun around and yelled into the tower, "Get the lead out of your feet. The men behind you have to get out too." U-612 suddenly slipped away tail first. A cry from the bridge, "Boat sinks! Get the hell out of there!" The last two machinists hoisted themselves up the ladder. Friedrich leapt across the valve station and ducked under the extension of the tower, then climbed up the ladder to the hatch. I followed. A sudden, heavy influx of water almost tore me off the ladder. I pushed against a ton of water, wedged myself through the opening, and was pulled to safety by the captain. Then the sea swept me off the bridge. At that moment, the bow of U-612 reached far out of the water like the hand of a drowning man. Then the boat sank rapidly. I was shocked by the suddenness of her destruction. As we floated in the Baltic, I realized I was without a life preserver. I had given mine to one of the guests. The water, however, was calm and warm, and only a gentle breeze ruffled the surface. Some distance away, Siegmund's white cap was gleaming in the sunshine. It was still neatly set on his head as he floated comfortably in his yellow life jacket. He was shouting across the water, "Keep close together, boys. They are going to pick us up momentarily." Then he turned toward me and called, "Did you get all the men out, exec?" "There is not a soul aboard. I was the last to leave." Black figures in yellow life jackets were bobbing up and down over a wide area. Beyond, far to the hazy south, I recognized the vague stripe of coast where the Vistula River emptied.